The morning Ilara Voss drove her wagon onto the patch of land bordering Cole Harding's ranch. He had been standing at his fence post with a cup of black coffee gone cold, and he felt something shift in the air the way it does before a thunderstorm. That particular electric stillness that makes the hairs on your arms stand up and your chest tighten for no reason you can name. It was the spring of 1878, out on the Oklahoma Territory plains, where the grass ran wide and golden all the way to the horizon, and the sky sat so big and blue above a man that it could make him feel either blessed or terribly small, depending on the kind of day he was having. Cole Harding was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his shirt, and eyes the color of creek water in summer, a shifting, quiet gray-green that his mother had called thoughtful and his ranch hands called unreadable. He had built his spread from almost nothing, 400 acres of good grazing land that he had claimed, fenced, and worked with his own hands for the better part of 6 years. He had a modest house of timber and adobe, a solid barn, 30 head of cattle, and a reputation in the nearby town of Dusty Fork for being a man of few words and considerable reliability. He had not thought much about the land to his east. It had sat empty for 2 years since old Sherman Pratt had died without heirs and the territory office had released it back to claim. Cole had considered buying it himself, but the price had been higher than he thought the acreage warranted, and he had let it go. He had not, it turned out, let it go quite far enough. The wagon that rolled onto that land on a Tuesday morning in April was a single-axle affair, sun-bleached wood, and a canvas top that had seen better weather. It was pulled by 2 sturdy mules who clearly did not share their owner's optimism about the venture, given the way they planted their feet and blew out their nostrils when they reached the dry creek bed at the property's edge. But the woman driving them did not pause or waver. She clicked her tongue, gave the reins a firm shake, and the mules, perhaps recognizing a will stronger than their own, moved on. Cole watched all of this from his fence line. She was not what he expected, though he could not have told you what he expected, since he had not known to expect anything at all. She was perhaps 26 or 27, dressed practically in a dark skirt and a cream-colored blouse with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. Her hair was a deep auburn, pinned up but already beginning to escape in the light morning wind, strands of it catching the sun and going a bright coppery red. She sat straight-backed on the wagon seat with the kind of posture that didn't come from being taught to sit properly, but from being a woman who simply refused to slump. She did not look at Cole until she had brought the wagon to a stop on the flat ground near the center of the property, climbed down without assistance, put her hands on her hips, and taken a long, slow look at the land in every direction. Only then did she turn and find him standing at the fence and hold his gaze across the 200 yards of open grass between them. She raised her hand in a plain, neighborly wave. Cole raised his coffee cup in return, realized it was cold and he had forgotten to drink it, and walked back to his house feeling that the morning had already gotten away from him. That night he did not sleep well. He told himself it was the coyotes, which had been active that week, their calls cutting through the darkness in that particular way that sounds like argument and grief at once. He told himself it was the wind, which had picked up after sunset and was working at a loose board on the barn roof with persistent, irregular knocking. He told himself it was nothing. By the third night of lying awake staring at the timber beams above his bed, he stopped trying to tell himself things, and simply accepted that something had changed in the neighborhood of his thoughts, and that it was likely connected to the woman with the auburn hair and the unbroken mules, and the look she had given him from 200 yards away that had somehow managed to reach him anyway. Her name, he learned from Tom Briggs at the general store in Dusty Fork, was Ilara Voss. She was a widow. Her husband, a man named Henry Voss, had died of a fever the previous autumn, leaving her with the deed to a small plot in Missouri that she had sold to fund her journey west. She had filed her own land claim through the homestead provisions that allowed single women to claim if they were heads of household. She had no family in the territory. She had, as best as Tom Briggs could determine from her supply orders, plans to raise chickens, grow a kitchen garden, and do some manner of work that required needles and thread in large quantities, though whether that was dressmaking or something else, Tom could not say. Cole listened to all of this while pretending to examine a display of harness hardware, and he bought a buckle he did not need and walked out into the afternoon sunshine feeling as though he had done something slightly foolish, without being able to identify exactly what it was. He did not introduce himself that first week. He told himself this was because he was busy, which was true. Spring was the hardest season on a cattle ranch, all branding and fence repair, and the constant vigilance against the things that could go wrong with new calves and uncertain weather. He was up before dawn every day and not back in the house until the light had gone blue and the stars were coming out, and by then he was tired enough that going to sleep should have been easy. It was not. He could hear her, sometimes in the early morning before he rode out. The sound of an axe splitting wood, steady, unhurried, competent. The sound of the mules complaining about something. Once, just once, the sound of her singing, a low, clear sound that the wind carried to him in pieces, so he never caught enough of it to know the song, only the fact of it, and that was somehow worse than not hearing it at all. On the 8th day, one of her mules got through the fence. This was not uncommon. The fence between their properties was old, put in by Sherman Pratt years before with cedar posts that had begun to rot at the ground, and a mule that wanted to get somewhere badly enough would not be stopped by cedar posts. Cole found the animal in his north pasture, eating his grass with the serene confidence of a creature that had decided its problems were solved. He caught it without much trouble. It was a placid mule, once it had what it wanted, and he led it back to her side of the fence, repaired the gap with wire from his saddlebag, and looked at the repair and thought that it would hold for maybe 2 weeks before the post gave way again entirely. He tied the mule to the nearest sound post and went to tell her. She was at the back of her property when he found her, turning earth with a long-handled spade, working a garden plot with a focused intensity that meant she did not hear him approach until he was close enough to speak without raising his voice. "Miss Voss," he said. She spun around with the spade coming up between them as though she intended to use it, and for 1/2 second they stared at each other at a distance of about 4 feet, both of them startled, both of them reassessing. Then she lowered the spade. "Lord," she said, "you walk quietly for a man your size." "I apologize," Cole said. "I should have made more noise." "Yes, you should have." She pressed one hand briefly against her sternum, catching her breath. Her eyes, he noticed now that he was close enough to notice things, were a dark amber brown, almost golden, and currently expressing something that was mostly irritation but had a thin seam of amusement underneath it. "You're the man from the next property." "Cole Harding," he said, and took off his hat. She studied him for a moment. "Ilara Voss," she said. "Which I expect you already know since small towns have no secrets." "Tom Briggs talks," Cole agreed. "He does," she said. "He told me your name before I'd been in the store 3 minutes, and also that you have the best cattle herd in the county and that you once rode 40 miles in a night to help a family whose barn had caught fire." Cole felt warmth move up the back of his neck. "Tom talks too much," he said. "He was being complimentary," she said, and there was that seam of amusement again, wider now. "What brings you to my garden, Mr. Harding?" He told her about the mule. He told her he had tied it to her fence post and done a temporary repair on the gap, and that the post itself was failing and would need to be replaced. He told her all of this in his usual economical way, more words than he typically used in a single conversation, and he was aware of this and slightly uncomfortable about it. She listened to all of it without interrupting, which was something he appreciated, and then she said, "I have replacement posts. I bought them in town last week, but I have not had time to put them in. If you can show me which ones are the worst, I'll get to them." "I can help you set them," he said. He had not planned to say this. She tilted her head slightly, as though measuring the offer for its sincerity. "That's not necessary, Mr. Harding." "I know it isn't," he said. "But a bad fence between properties is a problem for both sides, and I have the equipment for setting posts. It would take you twice as long with what you have." She considered this for another moment, then nodded, a single definitive motion. "All right," she said. "I appreciate it. Can you come Saturday?" "I can come Saturday," he said. He put his hat back on, said good afternoon, and walked back to his horse. He rode home feeling that he had handled that reasonably well, all things considered. When he arrived, he unsaddled his horse, brushed him down, put him in the pasture, and then stood in his barn for a full 2 minutes in the dimness, doing nothing in particular, just standing there while the dust motes moved in the light from the high window. That night he did not sleep until nearly 2 in the morning. The rest of the week passed with the ordinary difficulties of ranch work. He had a young hand named Pete Calloway, who was good with cattle but terrible at showing up on time, and another named Dix Reeves who showed up on time, but was constitutionally opposed to any task that involved mud, of which there was plenty after an overnight rain midweek. Cole managed both of them with the patience that came from long practice, and by Friday evening the calves were branded, the north pasture fence was properly assessed, and the week's work was done. Saturday morning he loaded his post-hole digger and his tamping bar and a good length of wire onto his wagon, hitched his draft horse, and drove the quarter-mile around to her property entrance. She was already outside, and she had already located the worst of the fence posts. She had tied lengths of red rag to 6 of them, and she had her work gloves on and her sleeves rolled up and her hair pinned with slightly more success than usual, and she directed him to the first post with the businesslike efficiency of someone who had thought the problem through and simply needed the right tool to execute the solution. They worked together for 4 hours. She was not the kind of woman who stood back and watched a man work. She handed tools, held posts, tamped earth, and contributed to the effort in every practical way available to her. She was also, he discovered, good at silence. She did not fill quiet with unnecessary words, which was a quality he valued because so few people had it. When they did talk, it was about practical things: the land, the soil quality, what she was planning to plant where her water source was. But around midday, when they stopped to eat the lunch she had packed, cold cornbread and salt pork and 2 good apples, she asked him something that was not practical at all. "Have you always been alone out here?" she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the horizon, not at him, which made it easier to answer honestly. "Since I built the place," he said, "6 years. Do you have family nearby?" "My mother is in Texas," he said. "Near Abilene. I get down there once a year if the season allows. My father died when I was 19. "I'm sorry," she said, and she said it simply, without the elaborate softening that people sometimes applied to condolences, and he thought it sounded more real for that. "And you?" he asked, because she had opened a door and it seemed right to acknowledge it. "My parents are in Ohio," she said. "They think I've lost my mind coming out here." She said it without bitterness, just matter-of-factly. "They may be right. But the land in Ohio belonged to my husband's family, and once Henry passed, there was nothing there that was mine. I needed something that was mine." Cole looked out at the flat golden land around them, the wide open indifference of the Oklahoma Territory under the April sky, and he understood that completely. It was precisely why he had come here himself. There was something about land that a person chose and worked and made into something from nothing. It became part of you in a way that nothing else quite did. "Then you made the right choice," he said. She turned and looked at him then, and whatever she saw in his face, he could not know what it was, because his face was not the kind that advertised its contents. It seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded and gave him the apple from her own share and said he had done the heavier work and deserved it. He ate the apple. It was a good apple. The afternoon was warm and the sky was full of white clouds building to the west, and he was sitting on a fence post he had just set with his own hands, eating an apple a widow woman had given him, and something in him that had been running at a constant low-level tension for years was, just for this hour, almost entirely quiet. He drove home at dusk feeling, for the first time in longer than he could remember, genuinely rested despite having worked hard. That night he slept straight through until dawn. He noticed this the next morning with a kind of cautious wonder, the way a man notices that a tooth that has been aching for weeks has stopped, and is not quite sure whether to trust it. He went to church in Dusty Fork that Sunday, as he usually did, and he sat in the third pew from the back as was his custom. And after the service, he was talking to Walt Drummond about the price of beef at the railhead when he saw her come in the side door late, having apparently tried to attend but misjudged the start time, and stand at the back of the church for the final hymn. She caught his eye across the room, and he nodded, and she pressed her lips together in a very small, rueful smile about her own lateness. And somehow that small exchange, 20 feet of air and one shared moment of understanding, kept him occupied in the back of his mind for the better part of the afternoon. The weeks that followed had a particular quality that he later had difficulty describing, even to himself. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no single event around which everything turned. What happened instead was gradual and ordinary and somehow relentless, the way water works on stone, which does not feel like anything remarkable in any given moment, but which, given enough time, changes the shape of things entirely. He found reasons to be at the fence line in the early morning. She found reasons to be there too. They talked about her garden, which was coming in well, the lettuce and radishes already showing green rows. They talked about his cattle, about the particular difficulties of branding season, and what the summer grass looked like. They talked about the town, about the people in it, about the rhythms of the territory and how different it was from the places they had each come from, him from a small ranch in Texas, her from a farm in Ohio that had been modest and good and nothing like this. One evening in May he came by with a bucket of fresh milk because his house cow had given more than he could use, and she thanked him and invited him to supper, and he stayed 2 hours longer than he intended, sitting at the rough table in her small house that was still in the early stages of being made livable, listening to her describe her plans for the place. A proper kitchen garden, a chicken coop, a workroom for the dressmaking she did, because yes, it was dressmaking. She had brought a good sewing machine on the wagon, and it was the most expensive thing she owned. Women in the territory need good dresses, she said, and they need someone who will make them without traveling 40 miles to a city. I intend to be that person. You'll have plenty of business, he said, thinking of the ranchers' wives and the town women he knew, all of whom complained about the limitations of what could be ordered through the catalog. I know, she said, with a confidence that was not arrogance, just the solid assurance of someone who had assessed a problem and calculated a solution. It will take some time to build the reputation, but I have enough put by to last through the first year. He thought about the widow woman in Missouri, sold a plot of land, drove herself and her mules and her sewing machine across country to a piece of raw territory ground, made her own claim, turned her own earth, planned her own future. He thought about what that required of a person. Your husband, he said carefully. Was he a good man? She was quiet for a moment, and he thought he might have overstepped, but she said, he was a kind man, gentle. He wasn't meant for hardship, which made the last 2 years of his life very difficult for him. The fever that took him was the final thing in a series of hard things. She paused. I cared for him genuinely, and I mourned him sincerely. But I won't pretend I wasn't also a little relieved at the end, because watching someone you care about suffer is its own kind of suffering, and it had been going on a long time. She said this without apology, and he respected her for it. I understand, he said. She looked at him across the table. I think you might, she said. He rode home under a full May moon that turned the grass silver, and his horse picked its way along the familiar path with the comfortable certainty of an animal that knows exactly where it is going, and Cole sat in the saddle and let himself think, for the first time since she had arrived, about what he actually felt. He felt something. That was the only honest accounting of it. Something warm and specific and slightly alarming, because he had not planned for it, had not made space for it in the orderly economy of his life, and it did not fit neatly into any category he had previously maintained. He was not a man who had been without feeling. He had been in love once before, at 22, with a girl named Clara who had chosen a man with better prospects and been right to do so. But this was different in character, quieter and more pervasive, less like lightning and more like the slow rising of the sun, the kind of warmth that does not announce itself and only reveals its full strength when you realize you are standing in full daylight and cannot remember when the dark ended. He arrived home, put his horse up, went to bed, and lay there with his hands behind his head and the moonlight making a white rectangle on his floor, and he thought that he was in considerable trouble of a very pleasant kind, and that he had no idea what to do about it. The answer came not from him but from events. In June, 3 things happened in quick succession that changed the landscape of the situation considerably. The first was that a man named Garrett Hollies came to Dusty Fork. Garrett Hollies was 35, well-dressed in the manner of a man who wants to appear prosperous without having done the work to actually be so, with a salesman's easy smile, and a way of entering a room as though he expected it to reorganize itself around him. He had come, according to town talk, to look at investment opportunities in the territory, and he had taken a room at the Dusty Fork Hotel and had begun making his presence felt at the saloon, the general store, and wherever women were unattended. Cole knew his type. He had seen it before. The territory attracted genuine settlers and genuine prospectors and genuine hard-working people, but it also attracted men like Garrett Hollies, who had learned that a new land offered opportunities not just for honest work, but for the kind of schemes that required an audience that didn't know your history. He saw Holly speak to Alara outside the general store on a Thursday morning in early June, and he watched her face from across the street. The polite attention, the slight reserve, the small, careful smile of a woman who has learned to navigate men who think their attention is a gift, and he felt something he chose, consciously, to identify as purely neighborly concern. He identified it incorrectly. The second thing that happened was that Pete Calloway, his ranch hand who was perpetually late, arrived one morning with a black eye and a cracked rib, and the information that he had been jumped on the road from town by 2 men he did not know but who had told him, while making the point with their fists, that the Harding Ranch was too close to land that other people had plans for, and that Cole ought to think about selling. Cole looked at Pete for a long time. "Did they say anything else?" he said. "Said there'd be more conversations if the first one didn't take," Pete said, and then added, somewhat unnecessarily, "It didn't." Cole sent Pete to the house to rest and rode to town that afternoon to speak to the county sheriff, a solid and reasonably honest man named Frank Alcott, who listened to the story, wrote it down, admitted he had no leads on the men Pete had described, and promised to look into it. Cole thanked him, rode back, and spent the evening on his porch in the long prairie dusk, thinking. Someone wanted his land or land nearby. He had heard, circulating through the territory this past season, that there were parties interested in running a second rail line through the Oklahoma territory. Land along the likely route would be valuable in ways it was not currently valuable. His own spread and the property to his east, Alara's property, sat in a corridor that several people in town had speculated might align with that route. He thought about this for a long time. The third thing that happened was that Alara knocked on his door on a Friday evening, which she had never done before, and when he opened it, she was standing on his porch with her arms crossed over her chest and an expression that was trying to be calm and not quite managing it. "I need to tell you something," she said. "May I come in?" He stood back and she came in and sat at his table, which was plainer and more functional than hers, with no effort made toward decoration. And she told him that a man had come to her property 2 days ago, not Garrett Hollies, a different man, heavyset and not particularly pleasant, and made her an offer to purchase her land claim at a price she knew was below what the land was worth. "When I told him I wasn't interested," she said, "he said that it was an offer that benefited from being accepted early, and that the territory could be hard on a person who didn't have neighbors watching out for them." The sentence he said in response is not one he would have used in other company, and she had the good grace to pretend she had not heard it. "I thought you should know," she said, "because I suspect it's connected to whatever happened to your ranch hand." "It is," he said. He told her what he knew about the rail speculation and the land corridor. She listened with the focused stillness he had come to associate with her when she was processing information, not distraction but concentration. "So someone wants to buy up the land cheap before the rail decision is announced," she said. "That's my guess," he said. "They're using pressure rather than fair price because it's faster and cheaper. And they're starting with the weakest targets." "They think I'm the weakest target," she said. "Yes," he said, because she was intelligent enough to deserve a straight answer and confident enough to handle it without being coddled. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't come out here to be moved on." "I didn't think you had," he said. "Will you help me figure out what to do?" He looked across the table at her, the determination in her jaw, the steadiness in those amber eyes, the slight tremor in her clasped hands that was the only visible evidence that she was frightened, and that she was managing the fear rather than being managed by it. And he thought, not for the first time, that she was one of the most remarkable people he had encountered in his life. "Yes," he said simply. They talked for 2 hours. He knew the county land commissioner, a man named Artis Webb who was straightforward and respected the rule of law. He suggested that Alara register her claim improvement, the garden, the fence repairs, the beginnings of her chicken coop, formally with the county office as soon as possible, creating a documented record of her occupancy and improvement of the land, which would complicate any attempt to challenge the claim. He suggested she speak to Frank Alcott and make a formal report of the threatening visit. He said he would do the same with Pete's situation and would suggest to Frank that the incidents were connected. "There's also," he said, "something to be said for making it visible that you're not isolated." She met his eyes across the table. "Meaning you," she said. "Meaning your neighbors," he said carefully. "The Drummond place is 3 miles north. Walt Drummond is a fair man. Tom Briggs at the store is well connected. And yes, meaning me." There was a moment between them that was not quite comfortable and not quite uncomfortable, but something with its own particular quality, like the air before rain. "Cole," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. "I appreciate this more than I can adequately express." He was not accustomed to gratitude of that directness, and he dealt with it by refilling her coffee cup and changing the subject to the practical steps for the following week. She left at 9 in the evening, riding home on the small mare she had recently bought from Walt Drummond, and Cole stood on his porch and watched her go, and then went inside and sat at his empty table for a while, looking at the 2 coffee cups. Then he went to bed and did not sleep at all until nearly dawn, not because of worry, though the situation warranted worry, but because something else entirely was occupying the space where sleep was supposed to go. The following weeks were busy with the practical work of protection and legal establishment. Alara registered her improvements with Artis Webb. Cole made his formal reports to Frank Alcott, who had also received similar reports from 2 other small landholders in the corridor, and was now taking the matter considerably more seriously. Walt Drummond and a rancher named George Ennis, whose properties lay at the northern edge of the speculated route, were brought into the conversation. Garrett Hollies, as it turned out, was not the architect of the scheme, but an agent of it, a land broker working for a group of investors in Kansas City who were attempting to secure the corridor before the rail company made its official announcement. The man who had visited Alara was one of several employed by this group. When Frank Alcott made it clear that the territory had functioning law and that documented threats against landholders would be prosecuted, the pressure campaign became noticeably less aggressive. But it was not entirely over, and the summer had a tension running through it that kept everyone attentive. Through all of it, Cole and Alara worked side by side in the practical ways that the situation demanded, attending county meetings together, speaking to the same officials, sharing information. And through all of it, the thing between them grew, quietly and with the unstoppable patience of something rooted deep, until there was not a person in Dusty Fork who did not notice it, including Tom Briggs, who mentioned it to approximately everyone he spoke to for a solid month. They were not, in any formal sense, courting. They had not discussed anything, but he came to supper twice a week. She brought him cornbread when she made it. He fixed the section of her roof that had developed a slow leak after the June rains. She made him a shirt, a proper shirt, well cut and fitted, in a dark blue that she had matched with the appraising eye of a dressmaker to his coloring. And when she gave it to him and he looked at it for a long moment and then looked at her, neither of them said anything, and the silence said quite a lot. The summer moved through its long hot days and cooled toward September, and the grasses went from gold to amber to the deep bronze of early fall. It was in September, on a Sunday after church, that Garrett Hollies made one final and miscalculated bid for relevance. He intercepted Alara in the street outside the church, in full view of the Sunday-dressed population of Dusty Fork, and spoke to her for several minutes with the particular intensity of a man who thinks that persistence is the same as persuasion. Cole watched from across the street, standing with Walt Drummond, and Drummond glanced at him and said, mildly, "You going to intervene in that conversation?" "Not unless she wants me to," Cole said. Drummond looked at him with the wisdom of a man who had been married for 22 years. "Well," he said, "you might want to be standing close enough to be available, just in case the wanting happens." Cole crossed the street. Hollies was saying something about the investment opportunity still being on the table, that it was not too late, that the rational choice. When Cole came up beside Alara and stood there, not touching her, not speaking to Hollies, just being present in the way that a solid and large immovable object is present, and the sentence died. Hollies looked at Cole. Cole looked back at him with the gray-green eyes that his ranch hands called unreadable. Hollies reset his hat, adjusted his jacket, said good day to them both, and walked away, and the particular set of his shoulders said clearly that the conversation was concluded and would not be repeated. Alara let out a slow breath. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I didn't do anything," he said. "You were there," she said. "That was the thing." They walked together down the main street of Dusty Fork in the September sunshine, not quite touching, with about 6 inches of air between them, and Cole was profoundly and almost painfully aware of every one of those 6 inches. They stopped at Tom Briggs's store so she could collect an order, and while Tom put together her package, he said, with the casual delivery of a man who has been saving something up, "You two make a handsome pair, I'll say that. The whole town thinks so." There was a silence. "Tom," Cole said. "I'm just saying what's been said," Tom said with a shrug of complete unrepentance. Cole did not look at Alara. Alara did not look at Cole. They paid for the order and carried it out to her wagon, and he helped her load it, and then they stood in the street and both of them looked at a middle distance that didn't actually contain anything interesting. "The whole town," she said. "Tom has opinions," he said. "He does," she said. "Are they wrong?" He looked at her then. She was looking at him with the direct golden gaze that had reached him across 200 yards of open grass on the morning she arrived, and it reached him now just as effectively from a distance of 3 feet. "No," he said. "They are not wrong." The word hung between them in the September air, precise and weighted. She nodded very slightly, a single deliberate motion. Then she climbed up onto her wagon, gathered her reins, looked down at him from the seat and said, "Come to supper Tuesday, not just as a neighbor." She drove away before he could respond, which was probably wise given the state of his ability to form complete sentences at that exact moment. He stood in the street of Dusty Fork on a Sunday afternoon with the autumn sun on his face, and the sound of her wheels fading in the distance. And he thought that 6 months ago, he had been a man who slept reasonably well and knew the shape of his life clearly in all directions, and that both of those things had now completely and irreversibly changed, and that he was not the least bit sorry about it. Tuesday, he spent the better part of the day being useless at everything he tried to do, which was not his usual character, and Pete Calloway noticed this and had the sense not to say anything about it. And Dix Reeves noticed it too and said something, and Cole gave him a look of such unsettling mildness that Dix elected to spend the rest of the afternoon on the far side of the pasture where the looks couldn't reach. He arrived at her house at 6, which she had specified, and she had cooked a proper meal chicken, which she had raised herself and was now past the initial sentimental attachment to, with biscuits and gravy, and a dried apple pie that filled the small house with a smell so warm and domestic that it did something complicated to his chest the moment he stepped through the door. She had also lit candles, which she did not do on ordinary evenings. They ate and they talked, and what they talked about was everything. His childhood in Texas and the particular kind of loneliness that large open country can make in a boy who is serious and quiet in a world that rewards noise and showmanship. Her childhood in Ohio, the farm, her father who had been good to her and her mother who had loved her with a worried and slightly smothering kind of love that came from caring too much and trusting too little. Henry Voss, the kind, gentle man who had been wrong for the life she had ended up living but whom she had not known that about when she married him at 22. Cole's brief love for Clara, which had felt immense at the time and now felt like practice, like a sketch made before the real painting. The candles burned down and they did not notice. She said, at one point, looking at her own hands on the table, "I am not the same person I was when I was married. I thought I knew what I wanted then. I was careful and practical and I chose a steady path. And then the path ended and I was standing in open country with no map, and the terrifying thing was that it was also, in some way I didn't know how to admit, exactly what I had always wanted. The open country, the no map." He thought about this. Then he said, "I think you're the most honestly brave person I have ever known." She looked up at him. "I mean that specifically," he said. "Not brave the way people mean when they're trying to be encouraging. I mean it the way I'd mean it about a man I'd trust with something important. You are exactly that person." She was quiet for a long time after that, and he could not tell what was happening behind those amber eyes. But then she reached across the table and put her hand over his, and the warmth of it went straight through him like sunlight through clear water, and he turned his hand over beneath hers and held on. They sat like that for a while, with the burned-down candles making small golden pools of light, and the prairie dark pressing gently at the windows, and the distant sound of a nighthawk calling somewhere in the high air above. He walked home at 10 o'clock under a sky so full of stars that it looked like spillage, like someone had knocked over the heavens, and all that light had come pouring out across the dark. His horse moved underneath him with the easy rhythm of a late-night return, and he rode with one hand on the reins and the other loose at his side, and he was smiling in the dark where no one could see it, which he thought was probably fine. That night he slept better than he had since April. He thought, lying in the dark before sleep came, that there was something he needed to say to her, and that he should say it in a way that was clear and plain and without ornament, because she was a woman who valued those qualities, and because the thing itself deserved to be said plainly. He thought about what those words should be. By morning he had decided. October came in cool and bright, with the leaves on the few cottonwoods along the creek going yellow, and the mornings having a good sharp edge that made the cattle's breath show white, and the fence wire cold to the touch. Cole had the fall work to attend to moving the herd to winter pasture, laying in hay, checking and reinforcing the barn for the cold months, and he was occupied and sometimes exhausted, but there was a quality to the occupation that had changed. He stopped at the fence line between their properties on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks into October. She was there, feeding her chickens, and she heard his horse and looked up and walked over to the fence. He got down from his horse, which was a thing he normally did not do for fence-line conversations, and tied the reins to a post and took off his hat and looked at her. "I need to say something," he said. She waited because she understood how to wait. "I have been thinking about how to say it clearly," he said, "so that there's no misunderstanding about what I mean. I'm not a man who speaks in circles, but this particular thing I want to get right." "Take your time," she said quietly. "Since the morning you drove onto that land," he said, "I have not slept the same, and I have not thought the same, and I have not been the same, and I don't want to go back to whatever I was before, even if I could." He paused. "I love you, Alara, not as a neighbor, not as a thing that happened by proximity. I love you because of who you are specifically, the way you think, the way you work, the way you face hard things, the way you know your own mind. I have never in my life been more certain of anything than I am of that." The chickens continued going about their business in the background with complete indifference to the occasion. Alara stood at the fence with her hands clasped in front of her and looked at him, and her eyes were bright, and there was something moving across her face that was too large and too various to be called a single thing: relief and happiness, and that particular emotion for which there is no word. The one that happens when something you were afraid to hope for turns out to be real after all. "Cole Harding," she said, and her voice was steady and warm, "I fell in love with you somewhere around the first Saturday you came and set my fence posts, and I have been managing it since then like a woman carrying something precious across rough ground, very carefully, so as not to drop it." He looked at her for one long moment. Then he reached across the fence, put his hand against her face, and kissed her, over the top rail of the fence between their two properties, with the October wind moving through the cottonwood leaves and the chickens completely unimpressed, and the vast Oklahoma sky wheeling overhead, wide and blue and indifferent to everything except the fact of sunlight, which it delivered with complete generosity in all directions. When they stepped back from the kiss, they were both smiling in a way that had nothing self-conscious about it, which was unusual for two people who were ordinarily quite composed. "There is," Cole said, looking at the fence rail between them, "a structural limitation to this arrangement." "There is," she agreed. "I would like to ask you formally and properly whether you would consider—" "Yes," she said. He stopped. "I hadn't finished the sentence." "You hadn't," she agreed, "but the answer is yes." He laughed, which was a sound she had not often heard from him, and it was a good sound, warm and genuine. "I was going to say, would you consider becoming my wife?" "I know," she said. "And the answer is still yes, but I want to keep my land." He looked at her. "It's mine," she said. "I claimed it and I improved it and I want to keep it. We can work it together, join the operations, whatever makes sense, but I want the deed to stay in my name." He considered this for approximately the amount of time it takes to recognize a good and sensible position. "That's fair," he said, "and right." "Then we're agreed," she said. They were agreed. November was a busy month, full of the practical arrangements that turning two lives into one shared life requires. The question of where to live was settled by the practical superiority of his house, which was larger and better built, combined with the equally practical decision to expand it, adding a room at the back that would serve as her workroom, and fitting her sewing machine and fabrics and threads into a proper dedicated space. Her land would be maintained as part of the combined operation. The garden, the chickens, and eventually, she had decided, a dairy operation, because she had noticed that the territory had a shortage of good butter and cream, and she intended to address this. The wedding was held on a Saturday in the last week of November, in the church in Dusty Fork, officiated by the minister, attended by Walt Drummond and his wife May, Tom Briggs and his wife Clara. A different Clara, Cole thought, and found this quietly funny: George Ennis and his wife, Pete Calloway in his one decent shirt, Dix Reeves who had managed to find a jacket from somewhere, and about 30 other people from the town and the surrounding ranches. Because news travels in small communities, and a wedding is a thing people want to see. Alara wore a dress she had made herself, ivory wool with small pearl buttons, beautifully fitted, and her hair was up with a few copper strands escaping to frame her face as they always did, and she walked down the aisle of the church with her own 2 feet under her own power. And when she reached Cole and he took her hands, he looked at her with the gray-green eyes that the whole town had now decided were not unreadable at all, because they could read them clearly, and what they said was plain for anyone paying attention. They said, "Here is everything." She said her vows in the clear, low voice that he had first heard in pieces on the morning wind, and he said his in the careful, deliberate way he did all things of importance, giving each word its full weight. And when the minister pronounced them married and Cole kissed her there in the church, the room made a sound of collective warmth, the particular sound a community makes when something good has happened in its midst. Tom Briggs cried. He would deny this later, but May Drummond saw it. The reception was held at Walt and May Drummond's place, which was the largest house in the area and therefore suited to company, and there was food and a fiddle player named Aaron Silks, who could play anything you named and several things you couldn't, and there was dancing on the Drummonds' wide plank floor, and Cole Harding, who was not known for dancing, danced with his wife 3 times and stood watching her dance with Walt Drummond and Tom Briggs, with an expression that made May Drummond say quietly to her husband that she had never seen a man look so satisfied with his own life. Walt said he hadn't either, and he hoped Cole knew what he had, and May said she was fairly sure he did. They drove home in the dark, under the November stars, and the house was warm when they arrived because Pete Calloway had come ahead and stoked the fire, which was the most thoughtful thing Pete had ever done in Cole's knowledge of him. The new workroom smelled of fresh timber and her particular scent, lavender water and clean linen, and the house had both of them in it now, his plain functional things and her few beautiful objects, and the combination made a whole that was better than either part alone. The winter was cold and came in hard in December, the kind of cold that the Oklahoma Territory could produce when it chose to, with ice on the water troughs every morning, and the cattle huddled together in the low ground where the wind didn't reach. Cole and his hands worked long days keeping the animals fed and healthy, and in the evenings he came in from the cold to a house that was warm and had supper in it and had her in it. And the contrast between the hard cold outside and the warmth inside became one of the things he loved most about that winter, the way it made the coming home into something he felt in his whole body. She set up her dressmaking operation, and by mid-January had her first 3 clients, all women from town who had heard about the quality of her work and were willing to make the drive out. By February, she had a waiting list, which she managed with the same organized intelligence she applied to everything. She kept meticulous records, satisfied customers, and turned the workroom into a quietly thriving small business that was entirely her own, which was exactly what she had intended. Cole watched all of this with the particular pride that comes not from being responsible for someone's accomplishment, but from being close enough to witness it, which he understood was a different and better thing. In March, she told him she was expecting. She told him on a morning when he was at the table with his coffee, and she sat down across from him and said, without preamble, the way she said everything, "I believe we're going to have a child." He set down his cup. He looked at her for a long moment, and what happened to his face was something that only she ever saw, because he kept it off his face in public, a full, unguarded, almost overwhelmed happiness, the kind of feeling that is too large for a composed man to wear in company, but which, alone with his wife on a March morning in their kitchen, he did not bother to contain. He reached across the table and took her hand in both of his. "Are you well?" he asked first, because that was the first thing. "I'm well," she said. "A little unsteady in the mornings, but I've been told that passes." "Good," he said, and then, with a reverence he did not try to disguise, "I am so glad." She smiled at him, and it was the particular smile she kept for him, the one she didn't deploy in public or with clients or with the women of the town, but only in the private geography of their life together, and it went through him like sunlight. "So am I," she said. The spring of 1879 came in warm and early, the grass greening ahead of schedule, the creek running full with snowmelt, the new calves arriving in good numbers with few difficulties, as though the land itself was in a cooperative mood. Alara's garden went in bigger than the year before. She had spent the winter planning it with the same focused intent she brought to everything. And the chickens had been supplemented by the dairy cows she had decided on, two good Jersey animals that produced more cream than was strictly logical for two cows, and which she managed with the efficiency that had become her defining characteristic in the neighborhood. She was still sewing, though she had scaled back her client's schedule as the pregnancy progressed, accepting fewer new orders and finishing her existing commitments with the pleasant, unhurried pace of someone who has arranged her life to allow for the things that matter most. May Drummond came by regularly and had become a genuine friend, which Alara valued because May was a woman of intelligence and humor and did not waste time on things that did not warrant it. Cole was more attentive than he probably needed to be, and she told him so affectionately on a morning in July when he had come back from an errand in town with a package of peppermint drops that she had mentioned once 2 weeks ago liking and had not mentioned since, and he had remembered and bought them anyway. "You do not need to remember everything I say," she told him. "I know," he said, "but you're going to anyway." "Probably," he said. She opened the peppermint drops and ate one and looked at him with the amber eyes and the particular warmth that he had become the recipient of over the past year, and which he privately thought was the greatest fortune of his life. "You are a very good man, Cole Harding," she said. "You've raised my opinion of myself considerably," he said. "Good," she said. "You deserve a better opinion of yourself than you started with." This was true, and he knew it. And the fact that she knew it too was one of the things he loved about her. Their son was born in August of 1879, delivered by the doctor from Dusty Fork, and attended by May Drummond, who had done this before and was calm and practical about the whole business in the way that Cole desperately needed someone to be, because he himself was not calm and not particularly practical about it. He paced the length of the porch approximately 400 times while it was happening, and May came out at one point to tell him to sit down and eat something. And he sat down and did not eat anything. The child was healthy and substantial, with a fine pair of lungs and dark hair, and in Cole's considered but admittedly partial opinion, no particular faults. Alara held him with the steadiness she brought to everything, the steadiness that was not hardness but endurance, the kind that comes from the inside rather than being imposed from the outside, and she looked down at the baby and then up at Cole, and what passed between them in that look required no translation. They named him James, after Cole's father, with Henry as a middle name, for Alara's first husband whom she had cared for and mourned, and who deserved to be remembered in some form, and Cole agreed to this without hesitation, because it was the right thing, and because he was a man who understood that life is complicated, and that the complications do not disappear when you love someone. They only become things you carry together instead of alone. James Henry Harding was a loud and opinionated infant who had his mother's directness and his father's stubbornness, and who grew, in the months that followed, into a loud and opinionated and deeply appealing small person who the ranch hands adored and who developed, before his first birthday, a marked preference for being outdoors, specifically for the paddock where the horses were, where he would stand at the fence rail and look at them with an expression of focused longing that Cole recognized because it was his own. "He is going to be trouble," Pete Calloway said admiringly, watching James attempt to fit his entire head between two fence rails for a better view. "He is," Cole agreed, lifting his son back from the fence before the better view became a worse situation. The autumn of 1879 was the season in which the rail company made its official announcement regarding the Southern Line, and as had been speculated, the corridor it ran through included the eastern edge of the territory. Not, as it happened, directly through either Cole's property or Alara's. The line ran 3 miles to the north, but close enough that the land values in the area increased substantially, and the small landholders who had held on through the pressure campaign of the previous year found themselves considerably better situated than they had been. Frank Alcott, the sheriff, had made 2 arrests related to the threatening visits of the prior year, and both men had spent time in the county jail and paid fines, and the Kansas City investors, having assessed the legal and community resistance in the territory, had quietly withdrawn. Garrett Hollies had left Dusty Fork in the summer and had not returned, which was the town's general preference. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was the best winter Cole could remember in his adult life, which was something he thought about and did not say aloud because it seemed like a thing the winter might overhear and take exception to. But it was warm enough and the livestock were healthy, and his wife was thriving and his son was growing and the ranch was in its best shape since he had built it. And on the evenings when he sat on the porch in the cold blue dusk and looked out at the land, his land and her land beside it, both of them now worked as one operation. He felt something he had not had words for until this past year, and the word was simply home. Not just the house, though the house was home. Not just the land, though the land was home. The whole arrangement of his life, the woman inside, the child in his crib, the horses in the barn, the cattle in the winter pasture, the work that waited tomorrow and the work they had done today, all of it together made the thing that the word pointed to. He had not known before Alara that home was something that could happen to you. He had thought it was something you built, and he had built his, and it had been good. But he had not known that what he had built was a structure still waiting for something to make it a home. Until the morning, an auburn-haired woman in a sun-bleached wagon had driven onto the land right next to his, and his sleep had never been the same since. In the spring of 1880, when James was 8 months old and pulling himself to standing on everything available, they rode together out to the east end of the combined property, Cole on his horse and Alara on the small mare she still kept, and James in front of Cole on the saddle in the way that children ride with fathers on wide country land, with the big hands holding him secure and the small hands grabbing at the pommel with proprietary delight. They stopped at the highest point of the eastern section, where on a clear day you could see 30 miles in every direction, the grass running out to every horizon under the enormous sky. They stood their horses there and looked. "I have a question," she said. "What question?" "Are you happy?" she said. She asked it simply, the way she asked everything, not as a pleasantry, not as a rhetorical thing, but as a genuine question requiring an honest answer. He looked out at the land, and at the sky above it, and at her beside him on the small mare with her copper hair pulled up and the wind pulling strands of it loose as it always had and always would, and at his son in the saddle before him who was currently attempting to eat a piece of the saddle's leather, which Cole gently redirected. "I am," he said. "Completely. I don't have any way to say it bigger than that, but I don't think it needs to be bigger than that. I am completely happy." She smiled, looking at the horizon, and reached across the space between the horses and put her hand briefly against his arm. "Good," she said. "So am I." They sat there for a while, the 3 of them at the top of the eastern slope where the land ran out gold and wide in all directions, in the spring of 1880 in the Oklahoma Territory, on land that was theirs because they had chosen it and worked it and held it, and because the law, when pushed by people who refused to be pushed off it, had held with them. Below them, in the valley where the creek ran, the cattle were moving in the slow, purposeful way of cattle who have found the good grass. In the barn at the house they had expanded together, the horses stood in their stalls. In her workroom, a half-finished dress waited on the form for Tuesday's fitting. In the paddock, her Jersey cows were being placid and productive in the way that good dairy cows are. In the world beyond the boundary of what they could see, the railroad was being built and the territory was changing, and the Old West was becoming something new, as it always had been, as it would continue to be, full of hard beauty and hard work, and the kind of life that required everything a person had and gave everything back in return. None of that was out there for the 3 of them. All of it was out there for the three of them. Cole reached down and lifted his son up slightly, so James could see better over the saddle horn, and the baby grabbed at the horizon with his small fist the way babies do, as though the distant world is something that can be taken in hand. "Yours," Cole said quietly, meaning the land and the sky and everything under it. "Someday, all of it yours." James made a sound of complete agreement and grabbed another fistful of air. Alara turned and looked at Cole with the gold-amber eyes that had first found him across 200 yards of open Oklahoma grass on an April morning, and had not let him go since. And he looked back at her, and between them was everything they had made and would make: the land and the child and the love and the work and the whole long future of the thing they had built from a fence post repair. And a cold apple, and a question asked plainly enough to be answered plainly. The autumn of 1880 brought with it a new development that surprised them both in its speed, because Alara discovered she was expecting again in October, and this time she was less cautious about telling Cole and simply walked out to the barn where he was working and said, standing in the doorway with October light behind her, "It appears James is going to have a sibling." Cole set down what he was holding, turned around and crossed the barn in 4 strides and kissed her in the manner that had not diminished 1 degree in warmth since the first time, which he privately considered one of his life's great good fortunes, and she laughed against his mouth and said, "I take that as a positive response." "It is," he confirmed. The second child arrived in June of 1881, on a warm summer night when the fireflies were going in the grass, and the air smelled of honeysuckle from the vines Alara had planted along the porch the previous spring. This time Cole did not pace as much, only perhaps 200 times, a significant improvement, and Mae Drummond, who had again come to help, told him he was getting better at this. This child was a girl, small and precise and fierce from the first moment of her arrival, and Alara held her and looked at her and said, "Her name is Clara," which made Cole go very still for a moment until she added, "For my grandmother, who was the most capable woman I ever knew and who I intend this child to take after." "Clara," Cole said, and looked at his daughter, who was looking back at him with the unfocused intensity of a very new person who is busy taking inventory of the world. "Yes," he said. "That's right." Clara Harding grew from a small, fierce baby into a small, fierce toddler who followed her brother everywhere and who, unlike her brother's fascination with horses, was fixated on the chickens, which she administered with an authority that the chickens found bewildering and Cole found extremely funny. James, at 2 years old when his sister arrived, received her with the benevolent tolerance of a child who has not yet understood that siblings are a long-term commitment, and then over the following months discovered that she was actually quite good company, particularly once she learned to walk and could follow him to the paddock fence to look at the horses, which she was willing to do, though she found the chickens more interesting. The dressmaking business had grown steadily, and by 1880, Alara had more work than she could manage alone, and had taken on a young woman from town, named Bess Alcott, Frank the sheriff's niece, as an apprentice, which suited everyone and gave Bess a trade and Alara help with the larger orders. The dairy operation had expanded to 4 cows, and the cream and butter she sold through Tom Briggs's store had become a regular feature of the Dusty Fork economy. Cole had expanded the herd to 60 head and was sending cattle to the railhead at a consistent profit. He had also hired a third hand, a quiet young man named Samuel who was good with horses and who had come from a freedmen's settlement 40 miles east, and who Cole paid the same wage as his other hands and treated accordingly, which was not universal practice in the territory, and which Tom Briggs, to his credit, noted approvingly when he heard of it. There were those in Dusty Fork who had opinions about this that were not approving, and Cole was aware of them and had no interest in accommodating those opinions, and said so when asked directly, which was the only position available to a man with a conscience, and he did not consider it particularly heroic, just necessary. Samuel worked the Harding Ranch for 3 years and then moved on to a place of his own, aided by a reference from Cole that spoke plainly and warmly of his abilities, and started a small horse-breaking operation that eventually became the best in the county. The years that followed had the particular character of a life lived fully and with purpose, not without difficulty, because the territory was not without difficulty, and ranching was not without difficulty, and raising children was not without difficulty, and none of the harder things about the world disappeared just because a person was happy, but with the quality that comes when hard things are faced by people who face them together, which changes the nature of the difficulty without removing it. They had a third child in 1883, another boy, who they named Thomas after Tom Briggs, because Tom had been present at the beginning of their story in his particular way and deserved acknowledgement, and also because Cole liked the old storekeeper genuinely, and Tom cried again when told and again denied it. And by now, everyone had stopped pretending to believe the denials. Thomas proved to be the quietest of the three children, with his father's disposition toward thoughtfulness and his mother's toward observation, and he sat in corners watching people with a steady attention that was his father at 7 years old, unmistakably. In 1884, 6 years after Alara had driven her wagon onto the land next to his, and changed everything about his life in ways he had not anticipated and could not have predicted, and would not trade for anything at any price, Cole Harding stood on the porch of the house they had expanded together until it was a real house. A substantial timber and adobe house with a proper kitchen and a wide porch and the workroom at the back full of colors and fabrics and the steady tick of the sewing machine, and he looked at the land. Their land. 400 acres his, and the original 160 that was hers in her own name, the deed in her name where she had always wanted it, and they worked it all together. And in the long amber evenings of an October that had come in warm and gold, the whole spread had the look of a place that had been worked well and loved well, and would be worked and loved still by the people who came after. The cattle were in the east pasture. James, at 5, was in the paddock with Samuel's successor, a hand named Roy, learning to ride properly on a calm mare chosen for the purpose. Clara, at 3, was conducting some manner of administrative procedure with the chickens that they did not appear to comprehend but which she was not deterred by. Thomas, 1 year old, was in the house asleep in the way that 1-year-olds sleep, with the absolute commitment of someone who has decided this is the thing and intends to do it fully. Alara came out of the house and stood beside Cole on the porch, with a cup of coffee for herself and one for him, and they stood there in the October evening and looked at their land and their children and the wide sky above the Oklahoma plains that the years had not made smaller but only more familiar, more beloved. "Are you sleeping well?" she asked, and there was a warmth in it, the particular warmth of a shared history that has become a shared joke, because she knew the story he had told her eventually about those early sleepless weeks when she had first arrived, and he had not known what to do with what he felt. She found it endearing, which was a word he would not have applied to himself, but which he had learned to accept from her because she meant it without softening and without mockery. "Exceptionally well," he said, "for some years now." "Good," she said, and leaned her shoulder against his arm in the comfortable way of two people who have shared a life long enough that their bodies know each other's proximity as home. He put his arm around her, and they stood there, watching James on his mare go around the paddock with the focused seriousness of a boy who intends to be very good at this, and Clara instruct the chickens in something, and the cattle move slow and dark in the evening pasture, and the sun go down behind the low hills to the west in the way it went down on the Oklahoma territory slowly, lavishly, with great spillage of color and no apology for taking its time. Cole thought about the morning 6 years ago when he had stood at the fence line with a cold cup of coffee and watched a wagon come onto the land next to his, and felt the air shift the way it does before a storm. He thought about everything that had followed, the fence posts and the cold apple and the conversation across a table and the kiss over a fence rail, and the vows in the church and the children and the work and the years and all of it. He thought that a man could spend a lifetime building good solid things and still not know what a life was for until the morning the right woman drove onto the land next to his. He thought he was the most fortunate man in the Oklahoma Territory, and this opinion was not one he intended to revise. "What are you thinking?" she asked, the way she occasionally did when she noticed he had gone quiet in the particular way that meant the quiet was full rather than empty. "That I should have introduced myself sooner," he said. "That first week." She laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, the laugh he had been hearing for 6 years and which still did the same thing to him that it always had. "You took 8 days," she said, "and then a mule had to force the issue." "A good mule," he said. "An excellent mule," she agreed. They stood on the porch until the last of the light was gone and the stars came out, enormous and uncountable above the wide Oklahoma dark. The same stars that had been there on the night he had ridden home under a full moon after supper at her table, smiling in the dark where no one could see it. The same stars that had been there through all of it, impartial and brilliant, shining down on the hard and beautiful country where two people had found each other across a fence line and made, from the common materials of work and stubbornness and time and honesty and love, something that would last. Alara finished her coffee and took his cup from him and went inside, and a moment later he heard her moving in the kitchen, and James came in from the paddock with Roy and waved at Cole from the yard, and Clara abandoned the chickens to their own counsel and came up the porch steps with a piece of information about them that she delivered with great seriousness, and Cole crouched down to her level and listened to all of it with the full attention she deserved. And Thomas woke from his nap and made himself known from inside with the vocal insistence of a child who has decided sleep is over. Cole stood up, looked out at the land one last time in the full dark, and went inside. He closed the door behind him. The house was warm and lit and full of the noise and motion of the life that was in it, and he moved through it easily, completely, like a man who knows exactly where he is. He was home.